Welcome to this first video looking at structuring and designing effective presentations. This video concentrates on presentation structure. You need a good structure to your presentation as a whole so that the audience can easily follow your overall argument. They shouldn't have to work hard to understand how you're going to navigate through your topic to reach your conclusions. You should make it as easy as possible. So every presentation needs a clear beginning, middle and end. This is a basic story structure, so we know it works for getting information across to an audience. Different parts of your presentation have different functions. The main function of the beginning section is to make your audience want to listen, to show it's going to be interesting and relevant. You also want to announce your most important point, so they're aware of what you think is the most significant takeaway message. The middle section is usually where you can introduce your key points, expand on them and really develop your argument. And the end should draw everything together to a nice close with clear conclusions and return to your most important point. So, the beginning of your presentation is incredibly important. You must hook your audience right from the start. If you lose them at the beginning, you're very unlikely to be able to regain their attention and interest further down the line. So make sure you start strongly. Unless you're required to use an institutional or organisational template, you should try to give your title slide some real impact. The best way to do this is to use an interesting image. You generally have very little to get across on the slide, so you can maximise the wow factor by making the image as big as possible. Even if you are required to use an organisational template, try to get some imagery onto it to set the right tone for the rest of your presentation. Here are a few more examples. You should use the word you or your in the title of one of your introductory slides. This is itself a small change that can make a big difference. You want to make sure your audience knows that the presentation is relevant to them. So show how by adding the word you or your to an early slide. This will also force you to really consider exactly how it is relevant, which will put you in the right place for creating the rest of the presentation too. It's really important that the audience knows what's coming, so put a content slide in your beginning section too. This will help keep the audience with you as you progress through the presentation, as they'll be aware of where you're up to and what's still to come. As you can see, this doesn't have to just be a list of bullet points, though this would not be the worst slide to use them on. Instead, you could make your contents into a diagram to add extra interest. The last thing you should do in your introduction is to tell your audience what your most important point is. Think of summing your presentation conclusions into a single sentence. What would that be? This isn't a feature film, so a spoiler at this point is fine. Knowing the main point that you're leading them to actually makes it easier for your audience to follow your logic as you move through the presentation. If you make it clear that it's your most important point in your narration, then even if they forget everything else, they might at least take away that key point. The middle of the presentation should be the tasty filling in your presentation sandwich, where the main action of the story takes place. There are some different ways that you can structure this, and to some extent this will depend on your discipline or topic. This is a simplified version of a good structure to use for an academic presentation. It's a comfortable structure similar to that used in essay writing. It has the basic story structure of a beginning, middle and end that we've been looking for. The middle bit of the presentation is particularly structured with key points. You don't have to stick to 3, but you shouldn't really have too many, certainly no more than 5 or they stop being key. And each of the sections following the key points can be made up of as many slides as you need to explain the point further and give extra detail. As far as your most important point is concerned, explain how each of your key points is important to it as you move through the presentation. Repetition is important for maximum retention. This is another possible structure. Nancy Duarte, a respected author on presenting, developed it and she calls it her sparkline. It still has a clear beginning, middle and end, but the middle bit is a lot more dynamic as it takes the audience back and forth between two contrasting points. The presentation swings from one place to another. This is often what is at the bottom and what could be at the top. In Nancy's book Resonate, she analyses famous successful speeches and presentations and has found this structure used more often than any other. For instance, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech uses it, moving the audience between the dreadful state of racial inequality in 1963 and what things could be like if his dream of equality was realised. It was also used in Steve Jobs' presentation introducing the iPhone to the world in 2007. He swapped between what mobile phones have been like so far and what this new iPhone does. This structure can work really well for some academic presentations too, especially research ones where you want to show old and new knowledge or potential impacts. Sometimes your field or an event will have a formula for presentations. A fixed structure that looks something like this. Yes, this does look drier than some of the others, but it's something that those new to presenting may find helpful, and it may be what your audience wants and expects. You can still emphasise the story by considering what you class as the beginning, middle and end. And finally, it's worth thinking about how you can end strongly. Start by summarising the main points of your presentation. This can be 1 or 2 slides. Your final slide is particularly important. You don't want to stumble at the finish line. I would recommend that you don't end your presentation with a thank you for listening slide. It's a very common way that we see presentations ended, but it's not something you need to dedicate your last slide to. Nor is this. Everyone will understand you saying this without having a giant question mark to emphasise what you mean. Even a references slide should not be your final slide. It should be there to validate your arguments, but you can move past it fairly swiftly as few people want to stare at it for long. Incidentally, these are the references to some of the key research used in these videos. Instead, you need to reiterate this, your most important point, at the end, so that the audience remembers what you were arguing. And it's the last thing they see when you finish your presentation, making it more memorable. Also, if you think about it, if you're giving an in-person presentation, the slide that is behind you whilst you answer questions will be on screen longer than any other slide, often amounting to 1/3 or 1/2 of the time you took for your presentation itself. So it's your prime piece of PowerPoint real estate. Don't waste it with a thank you sign. Use it to make sure your main point hits home. When planning the structure of your presentation, it's always best if you plan it, at least roughly, right to the end before you create any slides. By doing this, you can ensure that there's a clear beginning, middle and end, and that you've identified the key points you're making and what is going to be the detail and explanation of those points. PowerPoint has a tendency to distract you from doing this by making you want to spend time making each slide look good, so it's best to avoid it at this stage. You can plan your presentation in many ways. Some people like to do it analogue, handwritten on paper or post-its. Post-its are good because you can move them around and scrunch them up and throw them away if you don't want to include them anymore. If you prefer to work digitally, then you can make use of a pre-prepared template to guide you with your message. Or if you really must open PowerPoint, you could plan your structure using the outline view. This is a little used view that you find if you go to the view ribbon. When you choose outline, instead of showing the slide thumbnails down the left of the screen, it'll show you your slide titles, as you can see in the image here. If you type a slide title and hit enter, it'll create a new slide, which makes it ideal to plan the presentation before you get sidetracked by trying to make it look all pretty and shiny. If we just take a quick closer look at this template, you might find it useful, and it is available on our Academic Presentations Skills Guide. So this is the beginning section. And just like an essay's introduction, it has 2 main functions: to set the scene and to preview what's to come. Unlike an essay, it has another crucial purpose, and this is especially true for external conference presentations. It has to make the audience want to listen, to make it relevant to them. So you start by filling in the audience at the top. This isn't going to be a slide, it's just there to remind you who you're aiming this at. Each of the other boxes in the template is a slide, so you should fill it with the slide title. First of all, the title of your whole presentation, then a slide to set the scene, and that slide to say why it's relevant to your audience, the one that uses you or your. There are then a couple of optional slides, and these can be very useful if you're doing a research presentation where there's an identified need and you're doing a task to try and address that need, but you don't need those for all presentations. You will have a slide that has your main message on it, and you'll have a slide that is your preview of what's to come. The middle section of this template is based on the key points slide structure. So here we've got boxes for what are the key points, and again some of these are optional. And each of these has explanatory points or explanatory slides that are going to follow those, and you put those points in the boxes on the right. If you need more, then this is just a word table, so you can split the cells in the table. And finally, the end of the presentation. Usually you'll have some sort of recap slide, something that reviews the main body and shows how you've reached the conclusion, which you give next, and then you return to that main message at the end. The important thing is to have a presentation structure that the audience can recognise. In conjunction with the content slide, the way you design the different slides in your presentation can help your audience with being aware of where they are in your presentation. For instance, by giving your key point slides a different design or a different colour scheme, you can make it clear that you're moving on to this next point, this next section of the presentation. By making your most important points stand out as well, you're giving them the emphasis they need. You could even make the beginning and end slides look a little different to the middle section, though that's not as crucial. If you're using the sparkline structure, you can make the two different levels look distinct. This can really help the audience get the point better. You can use brighter colours for the what could be slides and duller, more neutral colours for the what is slides. A bit like a home makeover programme on the television, where the old room is shown in a washed out monotone colour and then transformed into one that's all bright and cheerful and colourful. It can seem a bit contrived, but it actually works to emphasise the two different states. So, to summarise this video, you need to structure your presentation to have a clear beginning, middle and end, and each of those sections has a distinct role to hook the audience, develop the story and have a satisfying conclusion. You should plan all of this before you get distracted by creating your actual slides, which will ensure you focus on the message. Whatever structure you use should be clear and obvious to the audience, so they're aware of where you and they are in your presentation. Doing all of this should mean your audience can easily follow your arguments, maximising your presentation's effectiveness. The next video will look at the structure of individual slides.